Hi there and welcome to this first in a series of tutorials that's focusing on creating a bouncing ball animation. So some of the principles that we're going to be looking at over the next few lessons are going to include squash and stretch, timing and spacing, arcs, and easing in and easing out. So the whole purpose of the project is to be practicing Maya, practicing animation, not so much the modelling side. And as you can see, I've started by loading that up. So what we have here is the sort of intro feature that you get with every edition of Autodesk Maya, which you can download from Autodesk Student Account. With the What's New highlight settings, it just means that within the interface it's going to highlight things that it has added. So this is nothing really to worry about. If you want to turn these off, you can click these two arrows, and click OK. But for now, we're just going to keep that up, just so we can highlight anything that is new. So once we clicked OK, we'll start with our opening scene. And just to sort of get you familiar with some of the features in Maya, on the left hand side here we have our basic tools. So we have our selection tools, we have our translate tool, also known as move tool, our rotation tool, and our scale tool, which these bottom three in particular are going to be the most important, as they are the most frequently used tools. So underneath that we can change our viewport options. We have our perspective view, we have our 3-point view where we can see the top, the front, the side and the perspective. We have our perspective view and our outliner view, which is where all of the objects in our scene will be able to be selected from. We have the perspective and the graph editor, which we'll be able to edit and use in later lessons. We'll be able to edit animations and use in later lessons. And when this one loads, here we have the perspective and the hypershade, and the hypershade is used for making materials and textures for our objects, as we'll come to in a later lesson. And finally we have our node editor, our graph editor and our perspective editor, which we may or may not use. I'm still not quite decided on that. So we are going to start with just our perspective view. And before we get started, we're just going to change some of the settings. So I'm going to explain more of the interface, but for now, initially, there's a couple of things I want to do. So if we go down to this little running man down the bottom here, it will bring up our animation preferences, from which we can access all of the other settings. To do that also again, but from the menu set, we can go to, I think it's edit, select, modify. It's been a while since I've actually used this menu set. Yeah, I can't actually really go preferences. There we go. And we can go to preferences, which will bring up this same menu. As you can see, it's just quickly changed to the front. So one of the things that we want to change here is we can set our undos. Now you'll see here that I automatically have mine at 200. You may find that yours is set by default at 50. And I really recommend changing this, as you can never go back enough. I would recommend that your undo is done to not too high, because obviously if you've got a computer with a lower amount of RAM, it can cause a lot of lag and it can cause a lot of running memory issues. So 200 I find works quite nicely. And if we just go to the time slider, I would like you to just quickly change your playback speed, which will be by default play every frame, to real time 24 frames per second. Okay, and I think that will be everything in the settings for now, so we can click save. And so we have our interface. So it can be very tempting to rely on the shelf, for which you can create your own shelves and add your own tools to when using the menus. The one thing that I would recommend is that you don't rely on these, and we're going to use Maya without using these shelves. And the reason for that is they change in most versions, and they get adapted, and new buttons end up in different places. In this version of Maya, they've overhauled the icons. So again, it can be a little confusing if you're starting out, so we're going to go for the menu set. The other reason for starting with a menu set as well is because if you're ever stuck for anything, this is where you will go. And the more you use it, the more you'll get familiar with some of the terms and phrases and options within those menus. So to start, we're going to go to File, and we're going to click Save, and we're going to save the scene, and we're going to go Save Scene As. So we're just going to call this Bouncing Ball demo for now. It doesn't really matter, just as long as you've got a reference. And I do recommend doing a sort of underscore or just a space and typing 01, and we'll be able to save each version at 02, 03, 04. So we'll do it 01 and lesson 1. So, and that just sort of tells us what that's going to be. You have two options. You can change as an ASCII file or a binary. I tend to prefer the ASCII file over the binary, but either should be okay. The binary does protect quite well against corruption, so, and doesn't bug out as much. So I think I'm happy with everything, so I'm just going to click Save As, and we're going to get started. So once this is saved, we're going to go and use our top menu set. So just give this a second. It's interesting, it's taking a while. There we go. Continue. So this box will pop up, and what this means is that it's a student version of Maya intended for personal use only. If you try and do some work for a professional company using the student version of Maya, then obviously you will run into problems in terms of that company being able to open it. So please make sure that you are not doing commercial work with a student version. Obviously I'm using it in education purposes, so it should be fine. Click continue, and we are going to go to create. And what we're going to do is there's 3 types of primitives we can use. So just to go through these, I'm going to quickly push this bar here. This will actually pop out the menu. Okay. Now we have nerves primitives, which create a sort of angled sphere on cube, which basically create individual faces as separate objects, which are okay, but we don't want to use that. And obviously there are volume primitives, which allow us to add particles and things inside, but we want to focus on polygon primitives. Okay, so again, if we're doing lots of modeling, we can click that menu set and we can keep this here to sort of help us speed up our process. But in this instance, we're going to click sphere. Now, on several of the menu options, you'll always find these small boxes to the side, and what these boxes basically mean is it allows us to create objects with predetermined set of references. But obviously you may have not had much experience in Maya at this point, and so we don't need to worry about those. So we can click create here, or we can just click that one there. Either one doesn't matter. So we'll click create. It should close off this box and create a sphere in the middle of the screen. So I'm going to close this menu set now, as we don't need to focus on that much longer. So on the right hand side, you should see the channel box, the channel box, and the channel box allows us to utilize those features within the space. As you can see down here, I have translate, rotate and scale, which match up with these tools over on the left hand side. Okay, we have translate, rotate and scale. So if you ever get stuck with a tool, you can always click on the name, and it will allow you to use that tool in its selected direction, or you can select it over here. Underneath that, we have the inputs, which is exactly the same as those starting point options that we had in the settings. So now we can see our objects, we have the option to actually edit those further. But what we're going to do to start with is we're going to rename our object, and so I'm going to call this bouncing ball, and I'm going to call him Bob, bouncing ball Bob. So I recommend renaming all your objects. If you don't, you will find very early on that your scenes can get messy with lots of objects in, and you will lose specific points that you need. So by renaming those, if I just go to the outliner, which we could click this option here, or if we go to Windows and we go to which one are we looking for? The outliner, there we go. if we go to the outliner, you will see we've got Bouncing Ball Bob as opposed to P Sphere 1. So it just allows us to keep a nice organised scene, and file management is absolutely essential when you're working within a team of people. So please remember that you are helping your colleagues by renaming your objects, making sure everything's organised and everything's tidy. So I'm happy with these subdivisions and the height. Obviously we're working with animation, so we don't have to optimize our objects as you would do for games. And obviously the less faces we have, the more the easier it will run and the smoother it will run within our display. So these are really important, but not for now, not today. So with our objects, so to move around the viewport, there are a couple of controls that we need. The first one is to push Alt, or if you're using a Mac, Command and left mouse button, click and hold and drag. You drag the mouse and you'll be able to turn around your object. So that is Command or Alt, so Command if you're Mac, Alt if you're Windows, and left mouse button pressing and dragging, and it will allow us to rotate. Okay, so to zoom in and out, we can push wheel or scroll the middle mouse wheel, okay, which will allow us to rotate in and out. Very simple. And then if we want to reposition the camera, we can push Alt or Command again if you're using Mac and push the middle mouse button in. So that's Alt or Command, push the middle mouse button in, and you can drag left and right. And yeah, now if say we lose our object and we're rotating the space, it's not really showing our object there, because it can be quite difficult, we can push F, which will allow us to focus on our ball. Okay, so those are your basic controls, and if you go back into your weekly folders, you will find that tool list that we created a few weeks ago. Not tool list, sorry, but the control list. So F to focus, and we can scroll back out. So that is the basics. Now before we start animating, which is what we're going to be doing today, I've kind of gone into vertex mode, which we don't need to worry about right now. Let me select, there we go. So a couple of things. So hotkeys, which are the buttons on the keyboard, are really important. So there are 4 that I would really like you to practice with and remember, because we're going to be using these for constantly throughout every lesson that we do. So that is Q, which will bring up the select tool, which means if no option is selected, we can drag and select the ball. There is W, which will bring up the translate tool. As you can see, it's selected here now, and if we move, you can see the values change over here. If we push E, which is next to the W, we have the rotate tool, and this will allow us to rotate our object in whichever way we wish. Obviously with a circle this is not as practical. And finally we have our scale tool, which will allow us to change the scale and size. Now we have to be careful with this, because obviously over here within our settings, as you can see, we now have a scale of 1.824, which can get a little messy. So if you want to change the size of your ball, I do recommend using the radius, which will allow you to increase and decrease that without impacting the scale. Okay, so with that in mind, one other button that you may be interested in is the undo, which is Control Z, which will undo everything you've done, and we've set that at 200 now, so we should have a lot of numbers or iterations to go back on. Okay, so within our menu as well, as you can see at the moment, we have our mesh tools. As you can see, our drop down menu here says modeling. If we change that to animation, we will see that these menu options change. Okay, and now we have the tools and the buttons that are relevant to our animation sequence. So remember that if the menu does not display the buttons or tools you're looking for, or anything that I may mention, it may be that your drop down menu is not in the right place, and this will happen. But don't worry about it, just remember to check that. So I think we're ready to start animating, and you know, as I said, we're not going to learn to model right now. We're just going to focus purely on creating animation. So to change the viewport, as you know, I would like to be able to see our object, okay, from the front or the side. We can go to panels here rather than using these menus, and we have two options that I would like to focus on, which we'll use a lot. The first one is perspective and pers, which will take us to this view that we have right now. And if we go down to orthographic, you will find that we have front, side and top. Okay, and for this demonstration, I think I'm going to use the side. No, we're not. We're going to use the front, and there's a very specific reason for that, which I want to explain now. So, by pushing W on our toolset, we should hopefully bring up the tool. So, I don't want that there selected. So, right, okay. So as you can see here, we have a green arrow and a red arrow. Okay, now you'll notice on all of our tools that we will have translate X, translate Y, translate Z, rotate X, rotate Y, rotate Z, scale X, scale Y, scale Z, X, Y, Z. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly go back to perspective view so you can see this a little bit better. So what we have on our tool, okay, is 3 arrows. Now you'll see this one's gone yellow, and you may be thinking, why is that yellow? That's because that is the tool that is currently selected. So translate X, or any value that is X, will always be red. Okay, it will always be a red arrow. And as you can see, as I highlight over, it changes to yellow, which means that that one is now highlighted. If I click that, it will change to X, which means I can move it just along that rotation, that direction, sorry, not rotation. And obviously Y, the one going up and down, is green, and our Z, which goes down here, is blue. Okay, so those three are the tools that we want to remember. Okay, we need to remember those when we start animating and moving, because we want to retain as much control over our animation as possible. These little blue squares here, blue, red and green again, will actually allow us to do 2 of those channels. You can see as I move, it is selecting 2 of those values. Okay, so we can move those 2 at once. As you can see, our values over here have now changed on the right hand side in the channel box. We want to take them back to 0. So today we're going to work with Y, our translate Y and our translate X, okay, to keep it nice and clean. So I'm going to go back to panels, orthographic, and go to our front view, I think it was. Oh, wrong one. And as you can see, we've got translate Y, translate X. Now the first thing we're going to do is, by pushing Alt and middle mouse button, is to drag our view down here. Okay, and we're going to start animating a bounce going across this screen here to the right hand side. Now very quickly, I just want to explain one thing. So I'll push F to focus, and you can do the same if you wish. So what we have on our screen here is the different values for +1, -1 in both horizontal and vertical values. Okay, so if I take this and I go to our translate Y and I add in 0.2, or in fact actually I'll add 1, we can see that is a +1 growth. Okay, so it's moved up 1. If I change that to -1 and push enter, you can see it's now dropped 1, -1. Our 0 point is this cross in the middle, so if I just take that down, this cross point here is 0. Everything to the side is equal to 1 placement. And if I take that to 0, along our translate X, it's exactly the same thing. So here we have a positive value moving across, and if we go this way, we have a negative value. Okay, and that's going to be really important to remember, because our sphere, if you remember correctly, has a radius of 1. A radius is a quarter segment, so going from the center of a circle and moving all the way to its outer diameter. Okay, and well, not diameter, sorry, its outer circumference, which is the outside of an object. So we have a value of 1, which means that center out is equal to 1. Now our diameter, and the diameter is the space from one side to the other, which goes straight through the centre of the ball, is actually going to be double that. As you can see, it's 1 and then it's 2. And when I animate, I like to treat this 0 line here as for ground. It makes things a lot easier when placing ground objects on the floor, and just generally, because the line is thicker, it gives us a really good reminder of where our ground is when we are working through the graph like how we are now. So I'm going to pull the ball up, and I can drag this up and say, right, there we are, it's sitting on the ground, and that's fine, that's great. But as you can see, just very slightly, the tip of that is not accurately on that line, and the reason for that is it's 0.21 over, and so in order to alleviate that, we can just type in a value of 1, which keeps it really, really accurate. So we had our start point where our 1 was hanging over, and we've now moved our center point up 1. So our new center point is +1. Okay? But what we want is really this ground point here to be 0, to be our 0 point. So whenever we type in 0, it will always be on that ground line. Okay? So the way we can do that is to go to our menu set and go to Modify and go to Freeze Transformations, and this will reset all of these options in the channel box back to their default numbers. Okay, so if I go to Freeze Transformations, you will see now that our translate y has gone to 0. You'll also see that in the inputs it's recorded that transform as transform geometry 1. Okay, and obviously this is where our memory on our scene starts to build up, so we can always go to edit, delete by type, and delete history, and that will remove that information. What you'll also find though is it's moved our options to be able to edit the ball. Okay, so before you do this, you must be happy with what you have. To undo, you can always push Ctrl Z, and is it going to do it? Let's have a look. Nope. Yeah, there we go. So we have now brought that back, and we have all our options there. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start animating. So I've scrolled out, I'm going to push Alt, middle mouse button, and I'm going to drag my ball down to about here. Okay, and what we want is just create a little bounce starting up here and ending over here. So obviously our frame rates run at 24 frames a second, and I'm probably going to want about 4 seconds. So on our time slider down here, as you can see, I've just left mouse button clicking and dragging, selecting and dragging, and at 24 frames a second, or 25, around 25 frames a second, to make it nice and clean, we can change this to 100, and we do this by going into our time slider options. So this is our time slider, this is our range slider, I apologise, range slider. I'm going to type in 100, which will now keep our visible range exactly 100 frames. Okay, and that should keep it nice and tidy for us. So for 4 seconds, I'm going to have a little bounce and a little roll at the end. So you may be tempted to initially start by setting a frame here and moving the ball across over to here, but I tend to start doing the up and down and getting the beat of the bounce first. So I'm going to take my ball up, and I'm going to put it to around here. As you can see on the translate y, we have 8.047. I'm going to type in 8. Again, I just like keeping really nice and clean and tidy numbers, and most animators tend to set their sort of keyframe or their key poses, and one way of doing that is to push S. My pet hate with pushing S, and as you may find later on in your career as you get more experience, is that I like to retain all control over these channels. When using things like the graph editor, it can become very difficult to sort of work back through scenes and tweak them when we have so many keyframes set where we don't need them. So I'm just going to push Ctrl Z, and I would like you to avoid using S at all costs, because as I say, it can impact your quality of animation later on, because we have unnecessary keyframes that we then have to go and clean up. I tend to right click select the channel, so at this point I'm selecting translate Y, where my value is, and I right click and I'll go down to key selected. This will only select key this channel. Okay, so as you can see now, the red bar is only on the Y. If I go down to key all keyable, that means it's going to key every single value there that I need, which I don't want. So I'm going to Control Z. So now we have it at 8 on frame 1. I'm going to have the first bounce happen pretty quick, so I think within about 10 frames. And I'm going to have that go down to 0, which is our ground point. And again, you'll see here now it's not a dark red as it was before. This means that the value has changed. There are keyframes set on this channel, but they have not been recorded. This new input, this 0, has not been recorded. As you can see down here, we no longer have a red bar as we do at 1, because that red bar means it has been recorded. So by right clicking again and going key selected, we will now have it go dark red. We now have our red bar there, which means it has been recorded. So as we go through, we can see that drop. Okay, we can see that drop happen. So our first bounce down is going to 0, and as it goes back up, I'm going to take it back to 10 frames again. I'm going to take it back up, but I don't want it to go to 8 again, because obviously with bounces and energy and forces, over time the ball will lose its momentum and its power and its energy, and so we want to simulate that bounce wearing out and losing power and losing strength before gravity finally wins and keeps it on the ground. So I'm going to take this to 6, and again it's no longer dark red. We no longer have a keyframe here, so we can right click and go key selected, and we now have a bounce going down and up, which is perfect, just what we want. And we're going to go along 10 frames again, and this time we're going to go and put in 0. So this process of animation is known as straight ahead. Okay, you may hear this term, one of the old principles from the Disney Nine Wise Old Men, as they're known, where they call straight ahead and pose to pose. Or it may have been Richard Williams actually talking about that, thinking about it. Maybe, yeah, Richard Williams definitely talks about it. So by straight ahead, we mean animating one frame at a time in a continuous manner. But pose to pose is essentially what we're doing also, is going, so we're not going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and doing every single frame. We're actually going from the main pose at the top here to the next one. Unfortunately for us, the software fills those in betweens, which we'll have to tweak a little later on. So our bounce is losing momentum, as you can see. Okay, and we're back at 0 at 30. So at 40 now, I'm going to set this again. This time I'm going to go 4, because obviously it's getting less and less power. As you can see now, we're starting off really high, going down, and eventually it's going to lose it. So we're going to go back to 50. We're going to type in 0, and we're going to right click again and go key selected. So again, you may find this might be a little bit repetitive and a little bit boring and a little bit, okay, I'm getting kind of bored of keep having to repeat this process, but it is worth it. Your end product, your end animation, when it looks really nice, really beautiful, really slick, really realistic and believable, you are going to be thankful for the effort that you've put in. Okay, it's a really, really rewarding experience, and that's what I love about animation. So I'm going to go through again, type in 2, right click, key selected, and finally go back to up to 70, push 0, key select, go to 80, I'm going to type in 1, really losing that momentum there, key select, and then finally at 90 we're going to have that at 0, and we're going to sort of leave it there on the ground, so we've got our bounce. Okay, so if we take our go back to frame 1, and over here we have our playback controls, and we're going to push the play button, and we can watch our animation bounce. Okay, And as you can see, there is a bit of an awkwardness to the bounce, which we're going to look at amending in a future lesson. For now, we have our bounce falling nice and casually. So what we're going to do, as you can see now, we have it happening in the translate Y. Now what we need is for our bounce to bounce across the screen. Okay, so as we can see, we've got a red arrow. A red arrow means that we are working in translate X. Okay, because if it was blue, we would know that we were working in translate Z. But because it is red, we know we are working in translate X. If I click translate X, it will select that channel there, so I know it's selected. And I'm going to key this at 0, and I'm going to take my time slider all the way to 100, and in 100 I'm going to type in 20. I have no idea how far that goes, and it's pretty much fallen exactly where I want it. Okay, so I'm going to right click, key select. So as you can see from my quick playback there, we now have a ball that is bouncing across the screen. Now there are many tweaks and changes that we need to make to this. It's not the greatest animation, it's actually far from the greatest animation, but we've actually got the ball functioning. We've been using our translate tool, we've been setting what we call keyframes, and we have our object moving. So the important thing to remember is that it's an evolving process, and that you will, through practice and practice and practice, get used to the interface of Maya, get used to the embedding the animation principles within your work, and obviously making really cool and awesome animations. So in the next lesson, we're going to actually tweak this bounce and actually make it feel like it has weight and energy and movement. At the moment, it feels like a really awkward twirl mid-air, and it's really not comfortable to look at, and it's really not comfortable to watch. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create the next video, so please keep going through them, keep practicing, keep perfecting. The reason we're using the bouncing ball is it is one of the most standard used lessons in animation, because you are using weight, you are thinking about timing and spacing, and obviously there are many different types of balls that we can use. So I will see you in the next lesson.